Tomme Arthur joins me from Lost Abbey Brewing to discuss Belgian styles. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 160. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 160, and it's late November 2017. This week, Tomme Arthur, Director of Operations from the Lost Abbey, joins me to discuss Belgian beer styles. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They're running an amazing deal right now, 20% off your subscription when you use the offer code BeerSmith 2017. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers. And you can also read my new column there called Ask the Experts. Take advantage of their special deal when you use the offer code BeerSmith 2017 at beerandbrewing.com. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com. And also the BrewVision thermometer from Blickman Engineering. This interactive wireless digital thermometer connects right to your iPhone or iPad and lets you remotely monitor and record temperatures during your brew day. You can download recipes directly from the BeerSmith cloud and set updates and alerts as you brew. Get the BrewVision Bluetooth thermometer today. Another great innovation from BlickmanEngineering.com. And finally, BeerSmin Software, the industry standard for home and professional brewers, lets you design great beer recipes and brew with confidence. Download your free 21-day trial today from BeerSmith.com. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Tomme Arthur, co-founder and director of brewing operations at the Lost Abbey. Tomme holds an English degree from Northern Arizona University, but he found his passion in brewing and worked at several breweries, White Labs, and then Pizza Port, which led to Lost Abbey in 2006. He holds dozens of GABF medals, local, regional, and World Beer Cup awards. Tomme, it is great to have you on the show, man.
Welcome to you as well. I'm excited about this.
So, this is your first time on the show, but I had the pleasure of meeting you at I think it was the last two craft beer and brewing retreats we had out at Devil's Thumb Ranch out in Colorado. I really enjoyed those. Did you, what do you think? Had a good time?
Those are some great events. It's pretty exciting to be at that level with some very, very high quality homebrewers and enthusiasts, and just the chance to mingle with other professional brewers and to spend some time in that retreat environment was, I don't know, it's just been a really nice, way to go through a couple of days and drink beer with some new friends.
Well, the reason I go is to watch you guys brew. That's pretty much it, you know.
Yeah, we make a mockery of us as brewers. Very, very few of us make beer on that kind of a system, so it's always hit or miss as to how well we're going to be able to perform.
It's always kind of fun watching somebody who's used to, a 30-barrel system brew on a 10-gallon system or something, you know.
Yeah, I think everybody this year was shocked. I think every single one of us laudered in 20 minutes or less, and it was kind of a scary reality that, we could actually hit our gravities and only spend 20 minutes laudering grain.
Yeah. It was fun, though. A beautiful setting, too.
Beautiful place, yeah.
I mentioned you were an English major in school. How did you end up making the transition into professional brewing from there?
So I left San Diego in 1991, and I moved to school at Northern Arizona University, and I ran into a gentleman and his father, Mike and Tom Gardner, and they introduced me to better beer, basically told me that if I was going to drink beer that I needed to not drink some fizzy yellow watered beer. So they sort of indoctrinated me into all kinds of brewing beer. So we started with better American beer, better Canadian beer, better English beer, graduated to German beer, Belgian beer, things like that. And over my 4 years at Northern Arizona University, I basically drank my way through the world, whichever new beer I could get my hands on at the time. And Flagstaff had a pretty good, vibrant brewing scene, at least for beer. There was a lot of variety, and so we were able to get a lot of different beers in the 4 years that I was there. And then for my graduation gift, they actually picked up a homebrew kit for me, and that was given to me in January before I graduated in June, so that I had some time to make some beer before I graduated.
And so you were a home brewer for a while then, right?
I was a very poor home brewer. In fact, I never made a good batch of home brew until I started at the Cervecerías La Cruda and was taught all grain brewing and, most importantly, sanitation. And so, no, I made horrible home brew until I got to the brewing world. And then I had a small system and was brewing 5 and 10 gallon batches, sort of on an experimental level. Some of the things that we ended up using later in life.
Kind of a pilot brewer? Were you using a pilot brewery then, basically?
It was a little 15-gallon cut up homebrew, kettles and got igloo kind of mash tun, hot water keg, hot liquor keg and a boil kettle. Very very rudimentary, all gravity sort of stuff. Nothing fancy whatsoever. Nothing like what we brew on today.
And how long ago was this when you started brewing?
So I got my first job at Cervecerías La Cruda in about March of 1996, and I had been homebrewing really poorly about 8 or 10 batches before that. So really in 1996 is when I finally came to understand the fundamentals of brewing, and that's when better beer started becoming possible at the home level.
So you kind of caught that first wave of craft brewing. I remember it sort of peaked in '99, and then there was a little bit of a crash, right?
Yeah, I was, we toured around a little bit, and I remember walking into some of the original brewing places in Colorado. I was at New Belgian before they moved, Odell's when it was a very small place, HC Burger, which became another brewery in town, and things like that. So, very nascent brewing industry. In fact, when I was moved back to San Diego in 1996, there was less than 15 breweries in San Diego, and now we're up over 140. So it's come a long way since then.
That's pretty amazing. And let's see, you had a series of jobs in between, right? Before you moved on to Lost Abbey, right?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to get my first brewing job at Cervecerías La Cruda, and that was a position that lasted about 9 months. It was a startup brew pub, severely undercapitalized, didn't really have a good game plan. I met Chris White while we were brewing there, and he was fortunately, he offered me a position to come do some experimental brewing for them. They were really at the early stages of trying to understand at the home brewing level, how much temperature control and oxygen levels and ratios, and just trying to really understand how to make their yeast behave, and then communicate that to their home brewers. When I started working with them, they had less than 10 strains, I think, on the market, and not all of them were year-round strains. That springboarded from a conversation to an opportunity that Pizza Port needed a brewer for a little bit of the head brewer was going to have surgery, and I took over for the head brewer while he had surgery, and he never came back to work.
He never came back. Of course, White Labs is there in San Diego as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. They were right down the street from AleSmith back in the day. They've actually still in what's called the Beeramar area of San Diego. A lot of breweries have established their roots down by White Labs. And they're actually brewing their own beer now for retail sale. Yeah,
I saw Chris. We had dinner about a week and a half ago in Indianapolis. There was an event out there. A lot of fun. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
He's just a great guy to be around.
He's awesome. Yeah. He's
knows his stuff, right? Yeah.
Well, tell us a story about Lost Abbey, which evolved from Pizza Port. I guess you worked at Pizza Port for something like 10 years, right?
Yeah, so I got hired at Pizza Port in May of 1997, and I worked through the end of 2005 as the head brewer at the Pizza Port in Solana Beach. That's the original location. I was on a drive to Phoenix, Arizona probably in 1999, 2000 to do a beer event with Gina Marsalia, who's one of the owners of Pizza Port. And she had mentioned at that point that her brother had this idea for this brewery called the Lost Abbey. And the Lost Abbey was sort of an idea. It really wasn't anything more than a real sense of monastic type beers or Belgian beers, but not really brewed at a real abbey. So, the sense of it being kind of lost. And it was just a great name, and spent many years just kind of thinking about that as a name and what it meant to the branding and the possibilities for storytelling.
And how did that idea eventually turn into a real place?
So we were very fortunate in the summer of 2005. Stone Brewing had announced their new brewery project in Escondido, and Vince and Gina had a really good relationship with Greg and Steve. They in fact had purchased the very first keg of Stone Pale Ale when Stone launched in 1990. I think it was 1995, 1996. And so they offered the facility up for sale, but before they took it to the market, they asked Vince and Gina if there was any need for Pizza Port to do something. At that point, there was 3 Pizza Port locations, but none of them had really crossed into a production brewing environment. It was all brew pub based sort of brewing. And that's when Vince and Gina and I sat down and said, this makes sense to transition some of the beers that I had made in Solana Beach and some of the beers that have been made at other Pizza Ports under the Port Brewing umbrella, and then create this Lost Abbey idea that Vince had posited a long time ago, and bring it to fruition.
And of course, what is the focus of Lost Abbey? Obviously, some Belgian beers, but can you tell us what's different, what's special about Lost Abbey?
Yeah, so when we opened our doors, we decided that we were going to have two brands. Port Brewing beers were going to be very West Coast centric, and then these Lost Abbey beers that we say are Belgian inspired. And the goal was to really just nod appreciatively as much as we could towards Belgium, and have a lot of fidelity to flavor, a lot of fidelity to finesse and classic and great beers, and that's sort of that monastic and farmhouse tradition. And then we also knew that there would be a lot of experimentation within the boundaries, or what would amount to be the boundaries of that Belgian style brewing, sour beers and things like that, use of Brett. So we just knew that the Abbey brand was going to have a heavy Belgian influence.
And of course, you turned that into a lineup. I got some of the beers here, but it's very very much a specialty thing too, right? I mean, you're distributing in 750 milliliter bottles primarily.
Yeah, we actually are just getting ready to bring some new 6-pack 12-ounce glass online. But since we opened our doors 11 years ago, all of our Abbey bottles have come in cork finished 375 milliliter or 750 milliliter bottles. We've been in what we call that celebratory bottle, or that single serving, not a volume-based brewery by any stretch of the imagination. Our brewery has produced 15,000 barrels of beer the last 3 years, and probably not more than 5,000 or 6,000 of those barrels fall under the Lost Abbey umbrella.
Really? So I think you have a 30-barrel brewery, is what I recall, right? Is that right?
We do have a 30-barrel brew house, yeah.
So a 30-barrel brew house, but you're making these very small specialty beers. Are you making other beers there as well?
So we have the port beers, which are very West Coast IPA forward. We also have a new line of beers called the Hop Concept. And those three brands make up everything that we produce here at the brewery. But on the port brewing side, on the Lost Abbey side, we have 5 core beers, year-round beers, and then a bunch of seasonal barrel beers that come out as well. So quite a range of things under the Lost Abbey umbrella.
So because you're making these celebratory beers, you're obviously not competing directly with a lot of the mainstream craft breweries, right?
Absolutely. We really find ourselves being, we were an off-premise brand for the most part. We do have some draft business these days, but for the longest part of our, the first few years of our operations, we were heavily bottle focused in terms of production.
Well, let's talk a little about some of the beers you do make. Let's talk about for to start with some of the beers that you produce year round. There's several beers you make all year round.
So our best-selling draft beer is called Devotion. It was actually a beer that was inspired by Monk's Cafe in Philadelphia. It's a hop-forward beer meant to emulate the blonde beer from the West Vleteren Brewery. So the West Vleteren 6, the green cap. Very dry very dry hop-forward beer. 2 malts, 1 yeast, and 2 hops. Very simple, smashingly drinkable. It's a great beer on tap, and one of the beers that we're getting ready to put into 6-pack. Our very first Lost Abbey beer that we ever released was called Avant Garde, and that was a nod to the Bière de Garde farmhouse style beers of northern France, and just an all-around great drinking beer. Something I wanted to launch the brand with that was pretty simple and very clean, without being heavily yeasty. So we've actually been brewing it as a lager since day one, but we've fermented at a little bit more of a steam temperature to give it a little bit of a nice texture and a little more aromatics. So we're rebranding that beer as well in the new 6-packs, and it's going to be called Farmhouse Lager. And those two are kind of the front runners. We also have a beer called Red Barn, which was a spice saison. We were one of the very first breweries in San Diego to put out a year-round saison. And then our best-selling bottle beer currently is the 750 milliliter of our Judgment Day, which is an Abbey Quad made with raisins.
So, I mean, a lot of these, the most popular ones are more session beers. Obviously, the Quad isn't, but
yes.
That's your focus mainly for the year-round beers, right? Yeah,
we're trying to work in a range of between 5% and 7% alcohol for some of the more sessionable or more, more high occasion, I guess you would call them, a little more frequency. But we've run in the gamut. I mean, we've produced beers from 3.5% alcohol all the way up to 15% on some of our barrel-aged blends.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's a pretty wide range of things that we're able to do with this small facility.
And I've noticed a lot of your beers don't always fit into a particular style. Sometimes they kind of come in between, if you will.
Yeah, we're very conscious of style, and we understand what those rules and the rules and what the parameters do. But at the same time, we're not trying to be technicians to style. And one of the things that we're looking at is that interpretation of how beer can be and where it behaves. We have some very classically styled beers. Again, the Devotion as a hop forward Belgian style beers is pretty simple. And then some of our farmhouse beers get a little bit more out of those boundaries and just allow to kind of breathe on their own.
And of course, I think you have a whole series of beers that are actually not to style, right?
Yeah, so we're making a line of beers mostly under the barrel umbrella called non-denominational, and the point there is to say that not everything we're doing is Belgian in basis. We have a barley wine that's aged in brandy barrels. We've got some other experimental beers. Our cuvee has a basis of barrel-aged quad in bourbon and brandy barrels both, with sour cherries and wild yeasts and things like that.
Now, what kinds of problems do you run into producing, these very specialized craft beers on a large scale? Honestly,
it's taken us a long time to get good at the craft part of it. Everything that we've done in the past is bottle re-fermented, and so we've become technicians with bottle conditioning. And there's a lot of skill involved in and specialized equipment that we need in order to do that at a high level. We're working with low pH beers that are bottle re-fermented. We're working with wild yeasts and Brettanomyces and other microorganisms, and so there's a lot of opportunities for things to go wrong.
And I mean, how do you manage that? Things like, if you're bottle conditioning and then you're distributing the beer, you have no control over it once you let it go. How do you manage those kinds of things?
Well, we always use the word carefully. We manage things carefully. We have a quality manager that spends a lot of his time making sure that we're on point. We run somewhere between 3 to 5 yeasts in our fermentation cellar at any given time. So there's always that issue, and then of course the separation of church and state. We now have a dedicated sour facility with its own set of transfer hoses, bottling line, corker, cager, stuff like that.
That's one of the questions I had too. Yeah, how do you manage large scale production of sour beers? Obviously, there's always a risk of infection, right?
Yeah, we represent about 40,000 square feet of warehouse space now. That involves an enormous amount of extra space for oak barrels, as well as all the extra glass and supplies and just all the extra material that you need to produce this. And we have 3 brands and 5 different set of change parts on the filling lines. It's just an enormous beast of opportunity.
And I mean, do you have a separate bottling line for the sours as well, or how do you manage that?
Yeah, we do. We actually decommissioned 2 years ago. We decommissioned a small 16-head rotary filler that was our principal filler, and we moved it into another building and then put online a new 20-head CFT filler from Italy. So we have the capacity to do both cork and cage sour and non-sour, as well as cap finished beers as well.
And of course, you've gotten into barrel aging many of the beers. What kinds of barrels do you like to use? How long do you age them? How do you manage all that?
So when we opened our doors in 2006, it was a joke because we put 100 new barrels in play. And at that time, we claimed that we had one of the largest collections of oak barrels for brewing in Southern California. And that was a true statement at the time. It was a mix of bourbon and red wine barrels, or red wine oak, French oak mostly, wine barrels. And since then, we have moved to, at any given time, having about 1,300 oak barrels on site, mixture now more sour than non-sour. But we have used Heaven Hill bourbon barrels since the beginning, and we tend to enjoy the flavors from Heaven Hill tremendously. We've had brandy, tequila, rum, more red wine. We've had a cognac. We actually have some foeders, some oak uprights now. A lot of different varieties. In terms of time in tank and residence and barrels and things like that, the bulk of our sour beers actually start as Saccharomyces primary fermentation for about a 2-week window, and then we rack into barrels, add mixed cultures, sometimes add fruit, and then that beer would sit anywhere from 12 to 18 months typically to acidify and to go through the process of the sour fermentation. Beers that are non-soured, spirit barrels, tequila, rum, bourbon, brandy, anywhere from 9 to 15 months.
So are you souring the beers before? Are you like kettle souring them, or are you using a different method?
No, we actually are using primary Saccharomyces fermentation, so there's no acidification whatsoever.
Mm.
We actually can harvest those yeast. It's typically our lager strain or our house ale strain that we would run through the primary fermentation. We're not using aged hops, so we're not actively tainting the yeast in any way that way. And a lot of times we use barrel filling, what we call barrel filling blends or barrel filling bases, as an ability to keep our yeast healthy and move it on to the next generation. But all primary fermentation is Saccharomyces based. We have not gotten into any kettle or quick souring yet.
Yeah. Of course, that increases the production time. What are you looking at for production time to produce some of these longer aged sours, especially the barrel aged sours?
We have our most famous sour beers are Duck Duck Goose. It's a blend of 1, 2, and 3-year-old barrels. So that's probably the sort of the apex for production is about 3 years in any one barrel. The
Wow.
bulk of our sour beers are 15 to 18 months worth of contact.
And of course, you have to top them up if you're going to keep them going that long, right?
Yeah, we actually are pretty blessed because we're in San Diego, so the humidity is a little bit higher here than in other parts of the country, and we, as a matter of our production, don't tend to top up our barrels. We do have some evaporation, of course, that occurs, but we have determined that it's best not to, in our world, not to disturb the barrels that we're in. Although with the new oak uprights that we're managing, those probably will be topped up from the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
But our smaller barrels we do not touch.
Wow. You got a lot of work. You have like a cooper on site to manage all these barrels?
Yeah, we it's interesting. It's done by committee for the most part, and I'll tell you an interesting story. A few years ago, we all of the barrels are kept in an Excel file, so we kind of work off of this Excel file for sorting and capturing data. And somewhere in that time, we forgot to refill a set of oak barrels, a bourbon beer, for production. And then the following year came along, and it was time to release that beer. And we didn't have any in the warehouse, even though the notes said that we had clearly had some barrels. But we all kind of scratched our head and reminded ourselves that physical counts are kind of important too.
Did the barrels go dry in that time, or?
Yeah, we actually didn't purchase any barrels to do it, so
Oh.
they just literally just flat out whiffed on the production part of it.
Wow.
And the not even making the liquid.
Well, you've dived into some difficult to produce Belgians like Goose and Framboise. I mean, how do you make something like that on a commercial scale?
A lot of it's time and energy and committee. We spend a lot of time close to the finish line getting it right. So we do a lot of tastings, benchtop blending. We throw away a lot of beer. I was looking at some numbers the other day of how much beer we actually have to throw away in order to make some of these brands work. The last time we produced Duck Duck Goose in 2016, we had filled over 120 oak barrels, anticipating an ability to grow the amount of cases that we would release over the previous release in 2013. And a lot of those barrels didn't take. They didn't sour. And rather than using them and devaluing the liquid in the glass, we chose to throw the beer out and start over. So we were unable to increase the amount of cases from the 2013 to the 2016 release. But at the end of the day, we felt like we made a great batch of beer.
So what do you mean it didn't sour? It just didn't...
Yeah, so process-wise, I guess what I was told is that we collect the organisms or basically the slurries from barrels, and then we repitch them or harvest. And when they went to harvest them, they think that they may have killed off some of the cultures by using too much sanitizer in the vessels that was receiving the liquid itself. So the ability to make lactic acid was tempered by a sort of nuking of the organisms, specifically the house lacto that we're running.
So you ended up with regular beer instead of sour beer then?
We ended up with some oak aged blonde lager. Yeah. Not
Probably
terribly interesting.
Not that good, huh?
No. And then at that point, you've almost acquired too much oak character, and so even though you could add more cultures to that barrel, at that point you've got the wrong balance of oak and ratios, and so another year in the barrel to acidify it isn't going to help the cause if you've doubled down the amount of oak you got.
Right.
Yeah.
You want to say some more words about your non-denominational beers?
One of the coolest things we've got going on is we've got a program for some spontaneous fermentation that we're doing, and I think we're up to batch 12 now, and most of the beer in the original, I think through the first six batches of spontaneous, was sort of not great and it's not stuff that we used much of. But since batch six, we've been producing anywhere from 2 to 3 spontaneous batches per year, and have had some really nice success with those barrels. And you should start to see more of that as we move on in the future.
So when you say spontaneous, I mean, you're not open fermenting them. You're just putting them in just regular barrels, and it's picking up the yeast from the barrel, or what?
No, so our process is a little different. We actually go through the end of the week. So we do a standard brewing week, and the last brew of the week, we actually send from the mash tun through the kettle, through the heat X, and then we pump that back into the mash tun and let it sit overnight, and it picks up any of the crazy organisms and things that came along for the ride in the mashing process. And then the next day we will come in and rack those into new to us, so newly received barrels from a winery. They might be Brett positive, but the goal is to be as pure with respect to the spontaneity of that liquid by not putting it into previously inoculated barrels from our house. So our goal is to try to keep it separate from the barrels that have had other sour cultures in them, so that we have two different streams of acidified beer.
So you're picking up yeast just from the brew house then, I assume, probably from grain dust and stuff, right?
Yeah, grain dust. It's a heavy lactic fermentation, so we're getting a lot of lactic out of the sort of the cooling down. You take the mash and it cools down over the course of the days, and we don't clean the brew house until the end of the week typically. It gets rinsed out and then the next day. But on this, we basically are putting wort back on top of a cooled down mash tun. No grain left behind.
No grain left behind. Yeah,
no grain left behind, but clean, sparged, rinsed, etc.
That's pretty cool.
It works pretty interesting. I know the guys at Russian River, Vinny and I had talked about it at length back in the early days of when we launched our brewery, and they now have a cool ship for some of their stuff. But back when they first started doing it, they were running the same methodology of through the heat X back at a cooler temp into the mash tun, and then inoculating or racking to barrels thereafter.
Just leaving it right there, and you're fermenting right in the barrels then too, right?
Yeah, so it becomes 100% barrel fermented, and typically we're able to produce beer in that environment that's acidified in about 3 months' time, if not even less. But most of the beer we find is about 9 months to 12 months before we really think that it can join some of the other barrel beers that we're working on.
I guess I didn't catch this detail earlier. A lot of your beers barrel fermented then?
No, not tremendously. A lot of them are barrel aged for extended periods of time. The spontaneous is one that we do actually do a barrel fermentation on a bourbon beer. But for the most part, we're trying to take the cleanest beer we can to those barrels for long term.
Well, I wanted if you might talk a little bit about your next lineup, which is your seasonal lineup.
Sure. So the goal for us was to have a very standard core of beers, and then the seasonal beers, is kind of on the whimsy. Originally, we opened up with 10 Commandments as being one of our seasonal beers. That was a dark farmhouse style beer made with raisins and rosemary and orange peel. We also had our Gift of the Magi, which was a holiday beer to guard, and something that both of those beers featured some Brett in the packaging, and we added to that Carnival, which is a Brettanomyces based saison, which features Amarillo and Simcoe hops, and something that we're really proud of.
There's Carnival. I'm just popping a couple of these up here on the screen.
Yeah, Carnival was a 2012 gold medal winner at the World Beer Cup. Just a phenomenal glass of beer when we get it right. And
of course, a lot of your beers have won awards too, right?
Yes, thankfully, we have found homes for them. Sometimes we don't. We're on a cold streak of late. We haven't won at a World Beer Cup or GABF in 2 years. So the guys know they've got their work cut out for them.
Well, get to work, Tommy.
Yeah, we think it's important just to compete. Obviously being there is part of it, but you really want to showcase, and you can showcase without winning. And clearly that's something we're doing. We think that we're probably making some of the best sour beers we've ever made, but some people are making better, and that's just something we got to get our hands wrapped around.
How do you schedule and rotate your seasonal beers through?
That's a great question because it's changed a lot in the last 2 years. We brought on a new brand manager in February of last year, and his first comment was, this is the beer that got you here, but it's not going to be the beer that's going to get us home. Everybody is changing on a basically a two-year rotating basis, and so this year we've added I think 5 or 6 new seasonal beers to the mix, on a non-denominational and a barrel aged and Christmas level as well. So we're actively changing up the seasonal mix of things as well as the core beers going into smaller formatting.
Do you brew the same beers the same time every year, or is there some method to the rotation?
No, we've been pretty classical for the last 10 years with respect to these beers coming out every year around the same time. There is a little bit of change to better suit the market, but for example, our Carnival has come out every year in February, March to celebrate the arrival of Lent. So we've always said that it's a Lent style saison or a Lenten seasonal. Our Serpent Stout is a winter beer. It comes out every January. So, we've kept a pretty traditional calendar by many respects, just to be predictable in that regard. But it's certainly changing with new beers needing to be part of the mixture.
Well, one beer that stood out to me was Red Poppy, which is a celebration of red cherries or sour cherries, I think, right?
I was enamored with the Rodenbach the very first time I ever tasted that style beer, and it was my first sour beer. And I dedicated a good portion of my time trying to figure out how to make a beer like that, and that became Red Poppy.
So how do you do some of these large fruit beers? Are you working directly with the fruit?
It's interesting. We buy from all manners of different sources. In fact, we actually buy a decent chunk of our fruit from Cisco, which is a food purveyor, mostly because they have great quality fruit. It comes frozen and sanitized and ready to rock and roll. So Red Poppy is a brown ale. It's what would amount to be a dark mild, although we're brewing it much stronger than a dark mild. But that was the base recipe. We brew the beer with English ale primary fermentation for 2 weeks. Then we put the cherries in the bottom of the barrels, rack the beer on top, add the cultures, put a breathable bung on the barrels, and set the beer off to sit for 12 to 15 months.
So you put the cherries.
Blend it all back together.
You put the cherries right in the barrel then to ferment it.
Right in the barrel, yep. And our framboise you referenced earlier, our raspberry, it's an oud, sort of a oud brune raspberry, 8.5-9% alcohol beer. Same deal. We primary fermentation in the stainless steel, and then right on fruit for about 9 months in the barrel.
Do you run into challenges trying to separate the fruit later on?
We have gotten pretty good at having a set of different filters and capabilities to do some coarse filtration. We run a sock filter, not a plate and frame, so we're able to run a very coarse separation of things. And for the most part, no. Although the very original batch of framboise that we produced, some 2008 probably, we actually had seeds that carried through, and we had nucleation in the bottle with the seeds sitting on the bottom and the re-fermentation. And then when you open the bottle, the nucleation caused quite a bit of foaming.
Seeds from what?
From raspberries.
Oh, raspberries. Yeah, those are very small. They're harder to get rid of. Yeah.
And no filtration again, so it was all just natural settling.
Wow. Do you filter many of your beers, or you don't? Probably don't, right?
No, I mean we've historically been a pretty unfiltered type brewery. We are doing a lot of work with biofine these days and some things like that. About to put a new centrifuge online, hopefully before the end of the first quarter next year, just to give us a lot better ability to clean things up. We have a lot of waste and loss that occurs in the brewery from just trying to be natural with the settling, and be nice to recover some of that beer.
So the centrifuge would allow you to pull more stuff out of the sediment, I assume, right?
Yeah, I mean we're losing, we lose 10% of any transferred batch to the biofining and the natural settling process.
So do you do a lot of test batches in order to create some of these things, or do you just wing it with a 30-barrel batch? I mean, how do you do this?
Yeah, I spent a lot of years doing test batches in the 7-barrel system at Pizza Port, so we've been blessed with a lot of recipe basis and theory from those days of product development. But we, for the most part, we've been winging it here, and only recently have started working with a small brewery down the street here in Carlsbad, California, called Roller. And Roller has a little 10-barrel system that they're letting us use to brew 1 to 2 times a month to push out some small batch stuff. And once we get our head wrapped around how that system behaves, then we can really start to play around with some more experimental things. Right now, we're getting ready to produce a batch of Hellas down there tomorrow just to see how our base recipe for a lager works in their environment. And a couple weeks back, we brewed an IPA. And then once we get those baselines established, we'll be able to really deviate from that.
That's pretty amazing. I mean, you're doing these, very exotic barrel-aged sours without any kind of a test batch, huh?
Yeah, it's basically no rope, no rope catching us underneath, or no net safety buoys.
No net.
The biggest issue is there's just a lot of familiarity with our house cultures. There's a lot of conviction that we know how things go and behave in our environment, and rarely, knock on wood, rarely do we make massive mistakes that aren't correctable.
So, at the end, do you end up blending some of the beers then if you get something that's a little off, or how do you handle that?
Yeah, there's definitely, we've put it down the drain for sure. Sometimes we'll move it off to barrel land and see if there's a way to save it, or, increase its ability to be usable, serviceable. It's a gut feeling. Sometimes you just look at things and you say that's going to work or that's not going to work, but we're not afraid to put beer down the drain if we have to.
How do you go about deciding what to brew and when to brew it? Do you have a process you go through to decide which beers are worthy of including in the lineup?
Yeah, that's a little bit more set by sales these days in terms of what their asks are. They've of course been asking to find ways to be a little bit more IPA forward. They want us to transition some of the beers to have a little more new hop character to them, more differential kind of hopping from kind of a classic West Coast sense. We're kind of holding strong to our roots and our guns there, that we're not going down that path. We never made a black IPA, so that's seems to be
the trend, especially on the West Coast though now, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of it, but I was reading about the FOBAB, the Festival of Barrel Aged Beers, that took place in Chicago this past weekend, and how many pastry style stouts there were there, and I've got an old school sense of classic that we're not overly classic, but we definitely we're not going to be adding peanut butter or anything anytime soon.
No peanut butter. Are you making cloudy IPAs yet?
No cloudy, not intentionally. Yeah, no peanut butter beers, and no strawberry milkshakes.
Okay. Do you have a process you go through though, or do you have a panel? Is there anything? How do you decide what you're going to brew? You said marketing,
a lot of it just comes down to what we think the market will bear. If we decide that there's a need for this, like in the case of the farmhouse lager, that we think that that people will be looking for a little bit different style lager moving forward, and we thought that we were in a pretty good position to take advantage of that. And drink enough at the bar after work every day, and you'll figure out what beer needs to be made next. Those
session beers are great, aren't they?
They really are. And there's just, unfortunately, the problem with lower ABV beers is they're just so perishable. But everything's perishable these days.
Yeah. What was your most difficult beer to brew so far?
Most difficult beer to brew so far. We have had a lot of technical difficulties brewing a Hellas here at the brewery. Although we have great process, we have good foundation water, things like that, and yeast handling. I think that we were just doing some stuff over the years where it was a little bit too variable from batch to batch. And we sat down one day and said, maybe we should try this. And I think, knock on wood again, that since then we have picked up a pretty good baseline on the beer. And I don't think we have as many issues, but it was one of the most variable beers that we would produce.
And that was which one? I'm sorry.
It's called Road to Hellas.
Oh, okay. Just a hard beer to make, huh?
A naked style lager, right?
It was just, of course, the problem with that, of course, is it exposes any flaws, right?
Yeah, there's nowhere to hide in that beer, and it was, it's just one of those things where we were trying stuff that was normal to some of our ale production, and it was a little bit misaligned with what the more Germanic process probably was. And you start doing the notes and research on that stuff, and you can come to conclude pretty quickly where we were making some mistakes.
And Tommy, what's your favorite beer so far? The ones you made?
Oh, that's a dang good question. My favorite beer so far, I think there's been some batches of Red Poppy that were just pretty spectacular. Anytime we can make a sour beer that I can walk into a brewery in Belgium and hand them a bottle and know that they're going to be impressed by it, or that they should be impressed by the fidelity or the level of really the level of truism to their craft, I think is important. So just love having beers in my cellar and my world where I know I can walk in and share them with people who I really respect.
Yeah, I enjoy fruit beers as well, and I've been making big fruit mead, so I've been playing with a lot of fruit lately, and it's very interesting the flavors you can get out of it.
Yeah, we poured at the dinner during the last retreat. We poured the Veritas 019, which is our raspberry sour,
and that was lovely.
I think that may be the best fruit beer we've ever produced, and very, very proud of that one. So it's exciting to know that you have those and you can drink them whenever you please.
Yeah, I remember that beer. It was very memorable.
Yeah, and that's been the coolest part for us, is that was the first time we'd ever done a stainless steel fermentation for the fruiting of the beer, and so that was a primary Saccharomyces to barrel souring for 12 months, and then it spent another 6 to 8 weeks on fruit in stainless steel, and it was incredibly vibrant and bright, and just a beer that I'm not even sure we'll be able to recreate. It was just a special batch of beer.
Really nice, yeah. Well, the one thing that stands out with Lost Abbey, of course, is how unique your beers really are. What advice do you have for someone looking to make unique beers?
That's another great question. And I think the biggest thing for me personally is to know your position, know why you're doing things, and to really, you have to have a plan. And we've tried to stick to what's in my head, which is not always the easiest thing, because it's not, some of it's not as sexy in the marketplace, but we have some legacy brands now with the things that have been in our core. That gives us some nice predictability. There's a high level of experimentation that we can continue to do. It's been interesting to be in the business 20 plus years, because there's so many things that have changed with respect to, a lot of stuff has been covered in the last few years. A lot of breweries have figured out, and the big question is what's next if you want to be an experimental brewery. And, for us, we just know that it's not going to involve animal parts or weird adjuncts.
Nice. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that you stick to your I guess Belgian roots, if you will, such as it is.
I have a pretty simple thing that's served me well over the last few years, and that's been that we don't do esoteric for esoteric's sake. And there's certainly plenty of room in the world for crazy and novel and thought-provoking idealism, but we make a point that if it's in our beer, it's supposed to be there, and that there's a reason that it's there. And the reason is that we felt that it needed to be there.
Well, Tommy, really, really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you so much for being here, taking time.
Well, it's the first time I've been on an internet podcast, so this is good.
Yeah, well, this one's pretty widely watched, so I think you'll probably get at least some response from it.
Yeah, we sure hope we made your day.
But thank you so much for coming on, Tommy. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Anytime you want to come back, let us know.
And again, today my guest was Tomme Arthur. He's co-founder and director of operations at the Lost Abbey in San Diego. Tommy holds dozens of medals from GABF, World Beer Cup, as well as many regional awards. Thanks again, Tommy.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, a big thank you to Tomme Arthur for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing magazine. Every issue is packed with great information for homebrewers and craft beer fans. Take advantage of their fantastic sale and get 20% off when you use the offer code BeerSmith2017 at beerandbrewing.com. And also Blickman Engineering, creators of the innovative new BrewVision wireless thermometer. Remotely monitor your brewing system from your iPhone or iPad, record data, set alerts, and grab recipes directly from the BeerSmith cloud. The BrewVision thermometer, another great innovation from BlickmanEngineering.com. And finally, BeerSmin Software, the industry standard for home and professional brewers. It lets you design great beer recipes and brew with confidence. Download your free 21-day trial from BeerSmith.com today. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.